Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 31 of Seamwork Radio. And today we're talking about hidden sewing fears. It sounds kind of spooky. I feel like we should do this around Halloween or something. Sewing ghost stories. Yeah, so fear, I think fear might sound like a really strong word when it comes to sewing, but I feel like all of us have fears around our creativity. And it's probably the number one thing that inhibits us when it comes to any kind of creative act, any kind of creative activity. Like even as we were preparing for this episode and talking about it, I realized that I have a lot of fears that I wasn't even really thinking about. I didn't really have in the forefront of my mind, but they were definitely there and they were working their demon magic on me without me really noticing it. So we're going to talk about some common fears that people have around sewing, and then we'll share a few practical tips to address them once you do realize that they're there.
Yeah, so fear is probably the biggest inhibitor of creativity. I think most of us might not even realize that we have fears holding us back. But like Sari was mentioning before, we were discussing this episode last week and sewing fears. And I felt like we fell down the rabbit hole. We're like, and I'm afraid of this, and I'm afraid of this. I didn't even realize all the things that I'm afraid of. So we're going to dig in. I think something that came up, especially for me, was imposter syndrome. I think this is something that a lot of creatives suffer from. That, I always have this fear like, oh God, someone's going to figure me out. Like that I'm not as creative or talented. And I've just really been fooling everyone all along. Do you find that you suffer from imposter syndrome, Sari?
I mean, my personal theory about imposter syndrome is that I don't even know if it should be called a syndrome because I think everybody experiences it. I don't think it's like I don't think it's like something special that some people have to deal with. I think it's something that, I mean, to greater or lesser degrees, I'm sure. Yeah. But I think it's something that everybody feels at some time or another, unless maybe you're like a psychopath or something. Maybe you don't. But
yeah,
if you have
totally
normal humans.
Yeah, we had a discussion going on in the community, and I feel like imposter syndrome is something that comes up a lot. People also shared just like general, like, I'm afraid of like sewing zippers, I'm afraid of fitting, but the bigger kind of more like thematic fears tended to be imposter syndrome. And then also very much tied to imposter syndrome is fear of what other people think, which is a big bad fear.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, just something that makes us human. And if you don't identify with imposter syndrome, sorry, I called you a psychopath. You're probably not a psychopath.
You're not.
But
You're
I do think thinking about thinking about what other people are going to say is just a really normal human thing. And it manifests differently for different people. But I think it's just like such a common element of our humanity.
Yeah. Absolutely. You're probably just like very well adjusted if you don't worry about what other people think. Yeah. You had a really stable childhood.
And I envy you.
100.
Yeah. Like we were saying, I think that creativity really brings forth all of these fears. And I think that's what makes it so challenging and why a lot of people have difficulty expressing themselves is just because there's just a lot of fear to deal with. A lot of things that come up when you're finding new ways to express yourself. What do you think are like your biggest fears around creativity or around sewing, Haley?
I think that to be creative and to share your creativity is to show vulnerability. And I think that's definitely something that I have a really hard time with. I like to be like the rock, the stable person in kind of like any kind of situation. And so I think that that fear of being vulnerable is what probably holds me back from sharing more of my creativity with people. It's kind of odd because I obviously like work in a creative field and that's and I truly believe that every single person is inherently creative, but sharing my creativity is something that I just really struggle to do.
Yeah. I think that's really normal, and I definitely have that too. I'm sorry, there's like a leaf blower going on right outside. Can you hear it?
I can't.
Okay, good.
It's okay.
I wasn't sure if you guys would be able to hear me. The
Uh,
joys of working from home.
yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah, so
Um,
that's one of my fears is ruining the podcast with neighborhood noises. But anyway, yeah, I think that fear of sharing is like such a common theme for everyone, and that's part of what makes creative expression so hard. Is it's going back
mhm,
to what are people going to think, what are people going to say about me,
mhm,
and then also I think like how does it reflect on me and my own self image too, to especially if you
mhm,
feel like you're not good at something, especially when you're a beginner. I think it's real easy to use it as an excuse to kind of beat yourself up or tell yourself, well, I'll never be good at this. I'm not smart enough. I'm not creative enough. I'm not good enough to do this. So I think that's another real big fear for people. For me, another one that comes up is especially around sewing and craft. It's something that people don't take very seriously as
mhm,
like a form of creativity. It's kind of considered sort of trivial. And so that's another, I guess you would call it a fear, is will I be taken seriously? Is this, worthy of my time?
mhm,
Really, when I tell people about Seamwork and about my business and what I do, like I have this little feeling of, oh, people aren't going to really understand. People who aren't in the sewing or craft world aren't really going to understand this or why I do this or what's important to me about it. And that
mhm,
can be kind of isolating in a lot of ways. You have this creative expression that's meant to bring yourself forth into the world, but it's in some ways it feels a little bit like a wall somehow. So that's something that I've really thought
mhm.
about and had to deal with when it comes to sewing specifically. Do you have any ways that you address those kinds of fears, Haley?
Yes. I'm definitely like, it's a work in progress. I'm still working on it, but I tend to say yes to projects that intimidate me is one
Mm-hmm.
way that I find I'm working on it a little bit more in the past year, 2 years now. I think that one thing that's been really helping me to address this fear is confronting it directly by doing more video and working on the podcast, since my fear is really like rooted in sharing. Is I'm just trying to find ways to empower myself in sharing, because we talked about mindset. We've been talking about mindset all month, and I think that I like to try and treat myself the way I would treat one of my friends, and I would never want my friends to not think that they could share something that they're passionate about with me. And I want people
Mm-hmm.
to feel empowered to share what they're passionate about. So, yeah, just really saying yes to the things that scare me and trying to like confront it head on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why a sense of community is really helpful
Mhm.
for addressing some of these fears, to have that kind of support of other people who get it and who are in the same space that you are and deal with those same kinds of issues. I think is just it's so refreshing. It's so affirming. I think it
Mhm.
has been very, very helpful to me to have that kind of community.
Yeah, how do you address your sewing fears, Sari?
I think for me, it's been a matter of very slowly letting go of worrying about what other people think. And
Mhm.
I say that, but it's not easy. Obviously, it's not something you can just do. I think it comes with time and a lot of patience. And to some extent, I think it's part of maturing and just aging is you start to care less and less about what other people say or what they think. And I think
Mhm.
that's probably been the number one thing that's helped me to deal with any kind of fear around creativity. And I think the other thing is just thinking about the benefits and drawbacks, thinking about, yeah, I'm scared of this. I'm scared of what people will say or how somebody might react or how I might look. But on the other hand, what's if I don't do it, I'm not going to feel creatively fulfilled. I'm not going to feel proud of myself, or I'm going to
Mm.
feel like there's something inside of me that I'm not expressing. And that's a much bigger problem, I think. And I think it's a big problem for a lot of people in their lives is not having creative outlets. So I think putting it into that context of what's important to you and what you'll get out of it is really helpful in overcoming any kind of creative fear.
Yeah, totally. I think like, sharing has long been like one of my fears. And I think that by confronting that fear, which is like an ongoing thing that I'm working on, I mean, that's what ultimately is the reason why I'm like sitting right here today. I remember, I guess this was like 6+ years ago, just feeling like really stuck in the place that I was and seeing the call for writers for scene work, like, oh, this like new thing that Colette's doing, how cool. And feeling this pit in my stomach, like, oh my gosh, I could write something, but I was so scared. But I knew in that moment that I had to do it. Like I had to do the thing that was scary to me. And then, one thing led to another and I moved to a different state and now I work here. My life would be so different if I didn't do the scary thing.
Yeah, I think there's something in creative people. Actually, I think it's in all people, but if you identify as a creative person or an artist, I think even maybe more so is just this internal drive to have this self-expression in some way.
Mhm.
And I think it's real dangerous to ignore that. I just watched this documentary. I don't know if you've seen it about the artist Wayne White called Beauty is Embarrassing. Have you ever seen that?
I haven't seen that.
It's wonderful. It's about this artist Wayne White, and he designed a lot of the characters and puppets for Pee Wee's Playhouse.
Oh, cool.
Um, and he's just like a multifaceted artist, and it's a great documentary. But there's a lot of looking back at his early life and childhood and how he had to create, he had to draw all the time. And I think that's something that I think all of us have to some extent, but a lot of us repress and ignore and are taught to repress and ignore. And I think if we acknowledge that we have this really strong internal drive to create, then we bring it forth more and we
Mhm.
recognize it more and we feel it more, and then we can express ourselves more. And I think ultimately be happier.
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing is just, learning to listen to that creative, like it's like the creative angel on my shoulder and amplifying that voice so that it drowns out the voice of all of the negative talk and the fear. And eventually the drive to move forward becomes greater than the fear to stand still.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought we'd talk about also like what are some of the common fears that you've seen from the teamwork community? What are some fears that you've seen come up a lot?
I think that, like, kind of like I said earlier, that I see kind of like a divide. I feel like a lot of beginners tend to be more fearful of a skill. Like, I'm afraid of sewing sleeves or I'm afraid of bust adjustment, something like that. And then I think that as you begin to kind of overcome, and this won't be true for everyone, of course, as you begin to overcome your fears of these skills, I think that those greater thematic fears start to kind of surface. I think that fear that you're not good enough, that the project won't be good enough, that will be a reflection of your own worth. That seems to be something that comes up quite a bit in like one way or another.
Yeah, I think so too. I think another one that we talked about earlier was body fear, and
Mm,
this fear of really being really familiar with your own body and its measurements and what it
mhm.
actually looks like and what it actually is a really common fear. Some people are even afraid to take their own measurements and know what they are. I always found
Yeah.
really fascinating.
I used to teach sewing classes, in person sewing classes, and I taught a lot of beginner level garment construction classes. And that moment in the beginning of the first class where you see the horror on people's faces when they realize that they're going to have to measure themselves. That really struck me when I first started teaching sewing. So I started measuring myself in front of the entire class and like telling them my measurements. This is also in Los Angeles. And I think that the stereotypes are very true. And I think it made people feel more comfortable when someone who's a size 14, which is by no means, I mean, I represent like a pretty average American body type, stood in front of everybody in this class in Silver Lake and, rattled off my measurements. It made them feel like, oh, okay. And just remembering it's data. That's all.
Mhm. Yeah. I think another one for me, and I've seen this come up in the community, is I'm very time conscious. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that I'm one of the many things that I work on. But I have a lot of like anxiety about time and a sense of urgency about things that maybe I shouldn't. So I think the fear of doing something that is going to be a waste of my time is kind of a big one for me. And that's something I see among other sewers also, like not wanting to spend that time on something if you don't know it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. This has been something over the last year, having a child and having more limited time, that has been a real mindset I find myself getting stuck in.
hmm Yeah. And that's a hard one to
Mm-hmm.
address, especially if you really do have limited time, as almost all of us do. It's a tricky one, but I think it helps to think about what you're really getting out of the experience and not just, I'm going to make something that's going to be perfect and it's going to take X amount of time. But,
Yeah.
this is time that I can set aside to enjoy and do something that I love to do.
Yeah, really focusing on the process rather than the outcome is something that helps me when I find myself getting stressed out about wasting time. Because ultimately, even if my project turns out, even if worst case scenario, it's totally unwearable, I still took time to step away from my routine to spend time with myself, time with my creativity, and time to like, improve, because you always learn something even from your most horrendous fails.
hmm Yeah. So, what are some other ideas? What are some other tips that we can share that have been helpful, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to share my 6 tips for confronting your sewing fears, but of course I'm a work in progress, so you'll have to leave a review with your tips if you have
hmm
even more
Yeah.
ideas for how to help me with this. So, number one is recognizing the fear. You're not going to do anything to confront the fear unless you know what it is. And a lot of times, these fears can be kind of like insidious. You don't really know that they're lurking there in your subconscious. So, I mean, I think that it's maybe worthwhile to not dwell on it, but to think about what are the things that I'm afraid of that are holding me back with my sewing practice, with my creativity in general, and recognizing the fear. That's really step one. And then, secondly, maybe finding the root experience of that fear, if there was one. Was there a time where you were made to feel that sharing your passions was not okay, or was shameful in some kind of way? Thinking about those root experiences can really be grounding and help you to understand like why behind the fear.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times we have some kind of very trivial experience
Mhm.
that creates this echo effect through the rest of our lives. And if we don't think about what that was and how silly it was, then
Mhm.
we just keep living with those effects, you know?
Yeah, and it's not something necessarily that needs to be some like traumatic experience you had in your life. Maybe that is the case, but sometimes it can also be I was reading recently about children who were like classified as gifted or people who are classified as gifted when they were children and how that leads to a lot of fear in adulthood because very early on, that bar is set incredibly high for you, and you feel like you always have to live up to it. So, the root experience doesn't need to be some big trauma. It could be something trivial, small thing, like Sari said. Also, it could be something that you didn't even think of as a negative experience, but has really colored the way that you think about yourself.
Hmm.
My third tip is to think about the worst case scenario. Like, how bad is it really? I'm going to keep going back to my fear of sharing. Like, what's the worst thing that happens if I like share a project I'm really excited about on Instagram and someone's rude to me? Like,
Hmm.
okay, they're rude. Like, their words literally have no weight in my real life. Like, bye. I don't like if someone actually said something mean to me, I mean, I would be lying if I said wouldn't hurt me, but also I'd probably be more pissed off than I would be hurt, like realistically. The fourth tip is to think about who will really judge you. Usually it's not like really a specific person. Also, like if someone is judging you, that's most likely a reflection of them and not a reflection of you.
Yeah, for sure. I think this has been really helpful to me when you think about like you have this general fear of what people think or what they say, but then when you think about the people in your life, you're like, well, who the people who matter to me, are they really gonna would they ever say anything like negative about this? Of course not.
No.
When you get specific about it, you realize that this kind of general fear is really something that you've created in your own mind a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. The fifth tip is to let go of being perfect all the time. I think that this is something I struggle with, like being like an overachiever, is that someone shared the affirmation. I think it was in episode 29 that is really sticking with me today. Progress, not perfection. I can share something to share my progress, not to show off that I made this perfect thing that has no pitfalls at all.
Yeah. Perfectionism is so toxic.
It is.
It's such a difficult problem for a lot of us, and especially when it comes to creative stuff. Like it's very, very insidious.
And it's a standard that no one is holding you to but yourself. It's a self inflicted wound. That doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. It's just, you know, no one's holding you to that standard but yourself. Uh,
Yeah. Have you read the gift Brene Brown? Have you read The Gifts of Imperfection?
I have not read that one.
I love her. I found that book really, really helpful for overcoming some of this stuff. I don't think it deals very specifically with creativity, although there are some
Mhm.
other good books that do. But I think just recognizing how the idea of perfection, even if you don't really consider yourself a perfectionist, I would say I wouldn't have considered myself a perfectionist
Mhm.
before, but then I realized these perfectionist tendencies that I had after reading that book, and how it's something that is really present in a lot of our lives, even if we don't identify that way.
Yeah, something that really helps me to not focus on perfection is to think about sewing as a practice. I sew, but mostly I have a sewing practice. And I think that keyword really helps to remind me that despite imperfection, it's about showing up as imperfect as we are and doing the work because creativity begets more creativity. So ultimately you're never going to be worse off for showing up at your sewing machine and spending time to really nurture that part of your spirit.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It reminds me a lot of writing advice. That's another creative outlet for me is writing. The idea of, if anybody out there has read Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, she talks about first drafts and accepting that they're going to be really bad. And I
Mhm.
think that's something you can apply to a lot of different creative practices, and just accepting that things sometimes are bad, but it's all part of the process of making something that you're going to love eventually, or improving your skills, or just, like you said, showing up.
Yeah, totally. And I'm definitely better at accepting the imperfections in some parts of my life than others. I think that sewing being something I do professionally, I hold myself to a higher standard with that, which is not always the most helpful thing.
Yeah.
And then lastly, try a sewing affirmation. Counter those negative thoughts, those fears with an affirmation. We talked about sewing affirmations in episode 29, and we shared a lot of really helpful ones and gave some tips on how to come up with your own. So definitely check out that episode if affirmations are your style.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Those are all really awesome tips. I had this quote that I wanted to read that I really liked, that I think might just kind of help to cap off the episode. So this is a quote from Chase Jarvis in his book called Creative Calling,
Mhm.
which is a really fun, like, motivational book for creative people. He is the founder of Creative Live, which is a website that has all kinds of, like, creative classes on photography and design and all kinds of stuff. But in his book, he had this quote, so I'm just going to read it. "What matters is that you start. All you're deciding to do is to try. Do whatever you can with what you have. It will never feel like the right time. You will never be, quote, ready. Avoid preparing too much. Start before you're ready. Start with fear. Start with uncertainty. This is one of the biggest secrets of the most creative, happy, and successful people. Just start."
Mhm.
I really like that. I think just acknowledging the fear and then just doing it anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, show up. I mean, to your practice and for yourself. I think that's the best way we can nurture ourselves is just showing up because
Yeah,
it's the hardest part.
it is. All right, I'm just going to recap quickly what we talked about today. So, we talked about the importance of recognizing the fear that you have. I think you might have a lot of fears, if you're anything like Haley or I, that you don't even really acknowledge as fears, and maybe getting a little bit more in tune with those, and with whatever you're feeling when you're having negative feelings about sewing or any kind of creative practice. I think
Mhm.
just recognizing what's there. And then, if maybe there was some kind of root experience that caused this pattern for you, maybe investigate that. If there was something that kind of led you to have this kind of fear, that's a good place to start. And then, to help you overcome it, think about what's the worst case scenario and how
Mhm.
bad really would that be. And then think about, if you're worried about judgment, if you're worried about other people, like, who's really going to judge you, and whether there's actually a specific person out there who's going to be judging you, or if this is just more like a generalized anxiety you have about what people think.
Mhm.
And then the fifth tip is just letting go of being perfect all the time. And if you need help with that, I definitely recommend Brene Brown's book, The Gifts of Imperfection. I've read it twice. I think it's super, super helpful if perfectionism is something you struggle with. And even if you don't think it's something you struggle with, because I like I said, I didn't think that was a problem for me until I recognized what it actually looks like. And then the last one, if you want, you could try a sewing affirmation. And we talked a lot about that in episode 29. So you can go back and listen to that if you want to try having a specific tool that you can use to address fears when they come up. So that's our episode for today. And if you really struggle with perfectionism, if this is bringing up a lot for you, it can be helpful to talk to a mental health professional. If you really struggle with this, we're obviously just sharing our own experiences and what's been helpful to us, but we're just normal people. So if you feel like this is something that you really need help with, definitely talk to somebody who is trained to help you, because they'll be able to help you much faster and much better.
100%.
All right. And we'll link to that other episode on sewing affirmations and some of the books that we mentioned today that could be helpful to you. And there are a couple other books that I think could be helpful, and I'll put those in the show notes as well. So if you like this episode, be sure to leave us a review and let us know, because that's actually the number one way that people find the podcast. So either on Apple Podcasts, if that's what you use, or if you use Spotify or Stitcher, if you could just leave us a review, that is like the best way for us to promote the podcast and for other people to find it and share the Sew and Love. So thank you guys for listening today, and we will talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.